Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between economist Corinne Low and sociologist Jessica Calarco. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of nearly 400 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to our channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. Corinne Low is an associate professor of business economics and public policy at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on the economics of gender and discrimination and has been published in top peer-reviewed journals, and she was named one of Poet and Quantz's 40 MBA professors under 40 in 2024. Low and her work have also been featured by major popular media outlets, including Forbes, Vanity Fair, the Los Angeles Times, and NPR. And in the next several days, at a store near you, it's going to be everywhere in just a minute, as soon as this book launches. She is the co-creator of the incentivized resume rating method for measuring hiring discrimination and regularly speaks to and works with firms looking to improve their hiring and retention practices. Joining her is someone we're very fond of, Jessica Calarco. She's a sociologist and professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's an award-winning teacher and a leading expert on inequalities in family life and education. Her research focuses on education, families, and health decision-making. She is interested in the structures of power and privilege that maintain socioeconomic, racial, and gender inequalities in these settings, as well as the role of qualitative methods can play in uncovering these mechanisms. We were honored to host Jessica last September, almost a year ago, for her powerful book, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. So now let's welcome Corinne Low and Jessica Calarco to FAN.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And so I will kick things off here by thanking Corinne, actually, for inviting me to chat with you tonight to be part of this conversation about having it all. This book left me with, so much to think about, both personally and also professionally, in terms of, both my own work life and certainly the work that I do with my own research as well. So to kick things off tonight, could you tell us a bit about this book's origin story? How did you decide that this was the book that you wanted to write?
So I start the book by saying that in 2017, I gave birth to my son and also a midlife crisis because I had thought that if I just wanted it enough and worked hard enough that I could be an equal to men in the workplace and I could have equality in my marriage and split things equally. And the reality of that was not there. It was that I felt like I was falling behind my male colleagues because they had more time in their days. They were publishing faster than me. I felt like I was falling behind in the race for tenure. I was on the tenure track at Wharton. And in my relationship, I felt like I was, even though I was the breadwinner, I was taking on so much more of the parenting and the cooking and the cleaning and then just the mental load associated with that. And I just felt so squeezed and like things were so hard. And I wondered, is this just me? And I started looking at, I'm an economist who studies women, studies the economics of being a woman. And so I had the tools to do this. And so I started looking at time use data. And what I found was that it was not just me. What I found is that women's time is really more squeezed now than it has been. And that these problems that I was facing in my own life were structural. And so once I saw that, I wanted to get that information out to other people because I thought that the data, it both made me feel so seen and validated, but it also empowered me to make some different choices in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really comes through in the way that you write about it, kind of weaving together the personal and the professional and the data that you can bring to bear on these questions as well. And so in the book, you argue that compared to men, women often get what you talk about as a raw deal. And so what can you tell us, why is that? Is it just that women are bad negotiators or is there something else that's going on here? What do you find with the data and what do you find with your research?
Yeah, so I don't think it has anything to do with negotiation. I know we're going to touch on that later. I think it's this structural issues. And in the book, I kind of dive into the history of it and how we got here and why. But I think part of it is that the gender revolution was not as empowering as we think it was. It was actually kind of partly out of necessity. And that meant that what happened is that we had a partial gender revolution. Gender roles converged in the workplace, so women could hold themselves to the same standards as men. And because in theory, we could do the same things, we could fill the same roles, have the same careers, but gender roles didn't converge at home. So actually in the data, and this fact always shocks people, I find that men do the exact same amount of housework, of things like cooking and cleaning, as they did in the 1970s. And so I think those structural forces have left women kind of competing with half a deck of cards because we literally don't have the same time in our days. And then you add to that an explosion of parenting time, which we'll also kind of dive into more, and it just is squeezing women from all sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about your book is that you're trying to help women get a better deal, to recognize that the deck is stacked against them in these ways, that the hand that they've been dealt is not, the ideal one. And yet there are decisions that they can make about things like which career to pursue or whether and who to get married to, and, whether and when to have kids. And you tell readers, there's a quote that I like here that says, "I'm going to challenge you to rethink the parts of your life where you're not getting the deals you deserve and navigate to the better ones." So can you tell us, in a nutshell, how do we get this better deal? What are some of the strategies that we can use in our own lives? Or some of the participants asked, what would they recommend to their daughters about, starting out in life when we approach these kinds of decisions?
Well, I think a starting point is just recognizing that you kind of deserve to have more and that you the experience of your life matters. Because I think as women, we get so used to accommodating everybody else's needs and trying to make things add up, for our boss, for our spouse, for our kids, right? That a lot of times we lose track of our own needs. And even that, like, we are a member of our households. Like, we try to make choices based on what works for our households. And then we forget, like, no, I'm a member of the household. And so if it's not working for me, it isn't actually working for the family. So that permission to just try to do things differently is so important. And then I lay out a lot of specific strategies, like with your partner, with your kids, and kind of setting those boundaries. And then, in the workplace, right? And I think one of the biggest things to kind of get a better deal in the workplace is reframing our jobs, because we frame our jobs as like the purpose of our lives, because a lot of books have told us, like, you're supposed to lean in, you're supposed to work as hard as possible. And if you reframe your job as something that needs to work for you, then inherently you end up starting to see the ways where you're going to be getting more than kind of what you give at work.
Yeah, and I think, one of the I appreciate the sort of reframing of especially this notion that, you are a member of your household, that you deserve to have that kind of priority within the decision making or when the calculus of a family on those levels. And at the same time, I think you have maybe one of the more provocative points in the book is that you caution women, that love is not how they should be making decisions. Kind of this notion that, we should actually be wary of love as a sort of guiding force. And so I'm curious to hear, what did you find in your research around, well, why do we often feel so compelled to put love at the center, whether it's in our relationships with our kids or our relationships with our partners? And what are the risks of maybe focusing too much on love?
So I first want to say that, it's not that I'm saying you shouldn't at all be guided by love, or that love isn't this a valuable and a beautiful force. It's that I say that, love is a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? In choosing a partner, for example, you need to have it there. You need to have that spark and that romance, but you need other things too. And so I think anyone who knows me knows that I love being a parent and I love spending time with my kids, and I spend a lot of time with my kids, and I make choices that even in the book I would be like, yeah, maybe you should breastfeed, but you don't need to pump. And like, I'm on book tour right now. I have a 4-month-old, and I'm like pumping in planes, trains, and automobiles. So, take everything I say with a grain of salt, because in the end, right, when we love and when we care about people, right, we those are some of the driving forces of our choices. But I think we've heard a lot about behavioral economics and about how people kind of make mistakes because they have these evolutionary impulses. And so, you're focused on the short term instead of the long term. And you kind of have these biases like, left digit bias, like when something's $3.99, you think it's cheaper than $4. And I had never really seen behavioral economics applied to women, but I think it can be especially important for women, because behavioral economics is all about how the evolutionary forces that shape how we make decisions might be kind of ill-suited for the payoffs and costs of our current environment, right? And that isn't entirely true about women, in the sense that when you think about how essential caring is for the most foundational evolutionary force, which is the perpetuation of our genes, right? That almost swamps everything else, and it feels very life or death. And yet I've never seen somebody really write about how, there might be behavioral economics in women's choices, that our choices might be kind of too driven by these impulses to care and nurture that are so essential for the survival of our genes. But when you think about what creates happiness and fulfillment in our modern lives, there might be a mismatch there, because we might actually overextend ourselves, because again, we think something is a matter of survival. Like a silly example is that, in the setting in which our genes evolved, we needed our community to get us through a famine. So we had to care and take care of other people and make sure that everybody in our community was happy with us. But right now, whether or not you're the world's best PTA volunteer is not going to determine whether you make it through the winter, but it can still feel inside our bodies like it will. Like I panic if people are unhappy with me, right? So it's not to say I want you to take it out of the equation, but it's to just take a little bit of a step back and observe the way that loving and caring shapes our choices, and then to check whether that's in line with what brings us the most fulfillment and contentment and satisfaction over our lifetimes, or whether that's sometimes pulling us in a direction that's away from our best interests.
That makes sense. And certainly with this, this notion of kind of being careful about being pulled too far in one direction versus another, you also caution in the book about kind of not over romanticizing paid work, not being too quick to lean in, for example, that doesn't have to be dictating all of our decisions, that it's not, we don't necessarily want to be driven just by these love impulses. And we also don't want to just be driven by these monetary impulses. So can you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Yes. So I think that we need to figure out what is the objective of our lives, right? And that's going to help us put all of these other things kind of in proportion or in their place and kind of make good choices. And economists model the objective of human beings as maximizing utility. And I'm sure Jess is laughing a little bit because, that's so different from how, a sociologist, imagines the world. But so we model human beings as maximizing a utility function, the same way a firm maximizes a profit function. Of course, nobody's doing a math equation in their heads, right? But what we're saying is when the goal of human life is to maximize something that we call utility, which is the sum total of your joy, contentment, fulfillment, and meaning over a lifetime. It's a little bit deeper and richer than happiness, because sometimes maximizing utility means doing something that doesn't feel great in the moment, like setting a limit with our kid that we know leads to kind of more long-term benefit. So if you say that's your objective for your function for your life, then where does your career fit into that? Well, your career doesn't actually give you very much direct utility. And I know there's going to be some people listening who are going to push back and say, I love my job. Of course, it gives me a bunch of utility. What I tell people to do is picture what their lives would look like if money were no object. So if you were independently wealthy and you didn't need the income from your job, how much time would you spend working? What would your life look like? How would you be spending your time? And very rarely do people say, I would make sure to finish up those PowerPoint presentations and reports for my boss, right? Even the people who love their job say yeah, I would do that for 5 to 10 hours a week, because I enjoy it, but I wouldn't do it 60 hours a week or 80 hours a week, right? And that exercise helps you get in touch with what do you really value? What actually gives you utility? And what you'll see is that a lot of it is spending your time on things that you enjoy directly, like being with your loved ones or pursuing, your hobbies, your health, your artistic fulfillment. And so then where do our careers fit in? Well, I say in the book, your job is a technology to turn your time into money. It's a ATM that you can put time into and you can get money out of. And that's fantastic for maximizing utility, because a lot of things that bring us utility are things that we can buy with money, including food and shelter and schooling for our kids, right? But there's a lot of other things that bring us utility that you need time for. So these two things are kind of fundamentally in competition with yourself. And once you see the objective as utility, then you can kind of make an educated decision for yourself of how much of your precious time do you want to put into the money machine versus how much do you want to just convert to utility directly rather than through this indirect route of turning it into money to kind of buy utility. So that is my big pushback to Lean In, because Lean In offered this single vision of success that was saying success means climbing the corporate ladder as high as possible. And so you've got to work harder to do that. But I don't think that is what success means to everyone. I don't think that is what brings everybody the most fulfillment. And I think it's a real mistake for us to just look at that as our, single objective in life when there's really so many other things we're juggling, because then we can almost feel like a failure, right? The way I felt when I said like, oh, wait, like, why am I falling behind and not publishing as many papers as my male colleagues? Well, because I'm maximizing something different. So I say also in the book, like, don't compare yourself to someone who doesn't have the same utility function as you. Somebody else is always going to have a faster moving career. Somebody else might have a better looking house, right? They're maximizing something different than you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe the one question I would have on that point, this idea of don't compare yourself to anyone else. I wonder a little bit here about, does that normalize inequality? Does that, encourage us to be to settle for what we have, or to be comfortable kind of on both sides of the equation? Does it lead those who have less to say, well, I have to just work within my means? And does it lead those to say, who have more to say, I shouldn't worry about those who are, further down the ladder if we're never comparing ourselves to each other in that sense?
Well, this is an individual metric, for happiness. It's, by the way, it's not a prescription for policymakers. Policymakers should absolutely look at the distribution across individuals. But what you're highlighting also is different constraints. It's not just different values, it's different constraints. So if I were, maximizing and money was no object, right, then it's a lot easier to have that beautiful home life at the same time as you have the career, because you actually have all of this, paid help that's supporting you and having those things. And so that's also what I talk about in the book, is that also to make those hidden differences and constraints visible to yourself, that, what you can buy equals, your time multiplied, you put into work, multiplied by your wage. And then, except for the people, and when I teach my class, I literally write this on the chalkboard. I'm like, this is the equation, except sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes there's this hidden generational wealth, right, that's closing this massive gap between what you're earning and, what you actually have, right? So I think making those constraints visible to you lets us get rid of the self-blame of like, oh, this is me falling short. But I don't want it to stop us from interrogating a society that, makes there be such huge differences in outcomes for people who start out with different means. And that's something that's so important to me, I think, especially when it comes to the investments that we make in our children, because this is so often framed as, in the Lean In lens of like, our goal is career maximization, there's this language about like child penalties and how, if you have kids, then your wage doesn't recover. And, we just view children as like an impediment on this ultimate goal of climbing the career ladder, which is, when you think about those evolutionary instincts that shape us, that's completely backwards, right? The whole purpose of like earning money would be actually to have children and perpetuate our genes. But I think when you study women from different socioeconomic backgrounds and in different countries, then you understand that for a lot of women, they would say, wait a minute, my kids aren't an impediment to my career. The fact that I have to go to work is an impediment to getting to be the type of mother that I want to be, right? Why would I want to go work all day and leave my kids? And then it makes us see that really that's a privilege, to be able to not have to use every hour to just, put food in our mouths, and be able to take that time away from work to invest in our children. And so I think that's one of the most striking inequalities in our modern society, is the ability and the freedom to actually invest in our kids and invest in the human capital of the next generation is something that I think should be equally distributed, and it absolutely isn't.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that in the book, in the sense of the attention to the structural constraints, that women are up against, and that women from varied socioeconomic backgrounds and races are up against, and certainly across different national contexts as well, in terms of thinking about how, our ability to make these choices is often constrained in these ways, that can make it hard, to be able to pursue or to optimize, in the ways that we want to. And at the same time, I was really struck by, there were some findings here. I appreciated how you showed that even in the face of these constraints, women are often very savvy negotiators, actually, despite the way that we often, stereotype them or perceive them. And so I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about what some of your research found on that front, kind of debunking some of the myths around gendered essentialism and these kinds of gender differences between men and women.
Yeah, so this is the myth that I would love to kill, and it's the myth that it's sold hundreds of thousands of millions of books, that is, women need to act more like men to get ahead at work. And that's wrong for two reasons. It's wrong because, first of all, there's absolutely no evidence that male typical traits are more productive in the workforce from a actual profit perspective or productivity perspective. And two, there's no evidence, and in fact, there's evidence against the idea that if women were to copy or mimic those traits, that we would be rewarded for it. So that is not to say that on average that there aren't some gender differences. So there actually are. And that's not, it's on average. Of course, there's women who are more competitive than men, and, but on average, we do see differences in things like risk aversion, competitiveness, self-promotion, negotiating style between men and women. What there is not in the literature is, again, any evidence that the male typical traits are more productive. And I'll give you two examples. So the first is from a very canonical study by Muriel Niederle and Lisa Vesterland, where they looked at willingness to compete between men and women. They had people perform a task, and they could either be paid for what they did, or they could enter their score into a tournament where if they were the best in their group, they would get a big payout. But if they weren't the best, they would get nothing. And so if you're kind of middle of the pack or not very good, you do better by taking the shore payout. And if you're the best, obviously you do better by entering the tournament, right? They found that women were very hesitant to enter the tournament, even when they were the best in their group. And there was a real gap between men and women in sort of willingness to enter the tournament. And so people sometimes take away from that. They say, see, women aren't competitive. That's why they're not in these jobs. Or, that's why there's a gender wage gap, right? But what people always forget is that the paper is titled, Do Women Shy Away from Competition? Do Men Compete Too Much? And for the men who are in the bottom quartile of performance, the very worst performing men who are certain to lose the competition, 60% of them still enter the competition. 60% of the worst performing men are like, I've got this. I think it's going to be great. And if I am a CEO, I am way more worried about those 60% of men who are like, let's just go in guns blazing, doesn't matter if we're prepared or not, doesn't matter if we've got the goods or not, than I am about the women who are like, yeah, maybe they need a pep talk, sure. Maybe if they were my student, I would coach them to be like, yeah, go ahead, take a chance on yourself. But who are like, yeah, I'm going to hang back a little bit, make sure this is what I want to do, take the more cautious approach. I'm way less worried about them, and I'm way more worried about the excess competition. And then another example from my own research is in the domain of negotiation. I had heard so often that, men are better negotiators, women don't ask, this is part of the gender wage gap. So I assumed that there was evidence to support it. What I found was there was not. There was evidence that people rated men's negotiation style as better, stronger, more assertive, right? They said, like, yes, he's a good negotiator. But when you actually do an incentivized negotiation, there was no evidence that men were coming out ahead. I set up an incentivized negotiation where people negotiate over a $20 bill, and it could be 15 for you, 5 for me, or 15 for me, 5 for you. What I found was that not only when men and women negotiated against one another, they were equally productive, they were equally likely to get the higher payoff when it was a male and female pair against each other. But then I found something striking. Male-male pairs were more than twice as likely as any other pair type to fail to reach an agreement and not be able to divide the money. And the rule then was that if you couldn't agree, you both got zero. And so they walked away with zero. There was a possible $20 bill on the table, and they walked away with nothing rather than take the $5. And again, if I'm a boss, I'm actually more concerned about the man who might blow up a longstanding business partnership worth millions of dollars because he wants the extra 0.005% on the royalty contract or something like that, right? Than I am about the person taking the more collaborative approach. But I've never heard of a book that said, like, men, here, take a page out of female negotiating styles and learn how to improve your skills, right? So I really want to bust that myth. And I really want to stop telling women and young women that they need to act more like men, because again, that's not evidence-based. And instead, what I want to do is just ruthlessly push back on that idea every chance that I can, and push firms to be evidence-based and to value more female typical skills and recognize that these are actually contributing to corporate value.
Yeah. Oh gosh, absolutely. I think that's one of the most powerful messages in the book. And I think it is such an important point that I hope, is everywhere very, very soon. So thank you for that. Now we've talked a lot about paid work so far. And I was curious. I mean, so one of the things that I think is really interesting here is that you go beyond the typical domains of these kinds of, business books. And you offer advice not only for applying this kind of optimization framework, not just for your paid work roles, but for your home life too. And so can you tell us a little bit about how do we think about these kinds of optimization or getting a better deal, in our relationships when it comes to those kinds of questions? How do you think about those decisions?
So I think I want us to think about return on our time the way we think about like ROI with financial investments. And, I think often, like I said, all uses of our time are not created equally. And so going back to this explosion of parenting time, this is one thing that I think is absolutely squeezing women and flattening us. And it's such an important data point to understand, because it's so easy to feel like we're failing. And then even to have like people from our mother's generations being like, why are you making this so complicated? Like you're doing too much, right? You're working too hard and you're too anxious, right? And what's happening in the background is that we have this greater understanding of child development than we had in the 1980s. So we know that, holding your infants and talking to them and saying 10,000 words a day and sitting on the floor with your toddlers and sitting at the kitchen table doing homework with your grade schoolers, that these things are how we build human beings, that they contribute to their human capital. In the 1980s, it was perfectly acceptable to have, 20, 30 infants in a daycare, each in their own crib, and you kind of hand them a bottle assembly line style. Nowadays, because we have this greater understanding of child development, most states have these 4-to-1 mandated child to caregiver ratios. That's part of why the cost of childcare is skyrocketing. So what does that translate to for us? That cost is our time, right? Every parent on here kind of knows the extended bedtime routine dance with your kids and reading 5 stories, and they want to drink a water and you're processing the day's highs and lows. Okay, I grew up in the 1980s. My bedtime routine was go to bed. Okay, that our parents did not do what we are doing right now. And it's a beautiful affirmative choice for us to give our kids something different and hopefully keep them out of therapy. But it's also tremendously costly in terms of our time. And once you know that information, once you know, oh, it's not that I'm failing, it's not that I'm uniquely bad at this, it's that I'm literally trying to do something that doesn't add up in a 24-hour day, it gives you permission to make choices and to choose the highest return uses of your time. And so, what I say is, with all that stuff that we do with our kids, some of it is essential to their future, mental, socio-emotional, and even physical well-being. And some of it is driven by guilt and social pressure. It's a kind of like arms race. And there's some economists who call it a rugrat race to say, oh, my kid has to have all these different activities on 2 different sides of town, and we're driving someplace every night. And our high schoolers need to have a CV by the time they, apply to college. And I will tell you that your kids would so much rather have you be calm and connected and able to be present with them than have those things that you're kind of making yourself crazy over. And I mean, and again, I'm a hypocrite here because I try to do these things too, but even those hand-decorated birthday cupcakes, right? They would rather play a board game with you. So if you cannot be calm and connected and patient with your child and, listen to their story for the 1,000th time because you're so depleted trying to give them all these things that you think that they need, it's time to put your oxygen mask on first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I think a lot about in my own research, and that I've seen, a number of sociologists try to grapple with is, why do we feel so much pressure on that front? Why do we feel so much pressure to stay in that rugrat race? And I think what I've seen there in terms of both, my own research evidence and what I've seen from others is that, rising inequality plays a big role here, in the sense that, it is harder to get ahead in society than it used to be. And, maintaining a middle class position or an upper middle class position, there's more risk involved. And as society gets more unequal, parents feel more pressure. Mothers in particular feel more pressure to engage in these kinds of behaviors. And so, that to me, raises some questions about, is it just that we need to be like thinking about our own priorities, or is it also that we need to be making more demands on our employers, and saying, hey, we actually need to ratchet back, the amount of work if we want to raise, happy, healthy, thriving kids. Do we either need to do some things on the policy side of the equation to reduce some inequality, or do we need to, ask employers to give us more time, more energy, more space to be able to invest in that? And that it made me think about one of my favorite quotes in the book was, you say women don't want flexibility, they want boundaries. And I like that, to me, connected to this piece of, it's not just about women optimizing within the existing set of constraints, but we want the systems around us to change at the same time. And so I was curious if you could say a little bit more about those kinds of system changes that would be really helpful for us right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you said so many things that I 100% agree with. And I think that's one of the major problems, is that because investments in our children are so important and we now understand they contribute to human capital, well, there's tremendous inequality if the only way to be able to do that is to have a spouse who has a really high paying job who's going to enable you to potentially, invest more of your precious human capital in your child's human capital. And really, if that's something that we value, and it should be as a society, the creation of the next generation, we should have, social support structures, right, that actually allow women to do that. So, where a lot of women are facing a choice where if they go part-time, they're going to lose their health care. So they might as well just leave the labor force and be eligible for Medicaid, right? And that's a binary that we should never, set up. We should allow women to have, jobs that also allow them to be the types of parents that they want to be across the socioeconomic spectrum. Going back to that specific quote of women don't want flexibility, they want boundaries. So I think this is another one of the myths that I try to bust, is that employers love to throw up their hands and say, like, well, we can't hire women because. And an example of this is a firm that I advise that hires a lot of shift workers and, people who are kind of frontline employees, says, oh, we can't hire women because we do shift work and we have some of the shifts are overnight and women are interested in that. And I said, nursing is 86% female. And that involves shift work and overnight shifts. So, nope, it's something else, right? And what it was is that their shift work was, we tell you when you leave tonight what time we need you there tomorrow. And no, that doesn't work for women because you can't structure childcare around it. So the reason that nursing works for women is because it's highly structured, because there are boundaries. And when you're at work, you're at work. But then when you leave work, you know that you're off unless you're on a designated on-call shift that's on a very specific pre-scheduled time. And we could bring that into some of the ways that we do other jobs. And I mean everything from high-powered corporate jobs, where I think that, we could say, look, employers want people back in the office, and then we see women starting to leave the labor force, but there's a win-win here of, say, okay, we've recognized there's some benefits of in-office work, but we're going to limit it to end at 5 p.m. And then we're going to harness the benefits of technology, that if there's more work that needs to be done, it can be done asynchronously after our kids go to bed, right? To the jobs that, may have more kind of frontline workers, that just literally having better planning and posting schedules further in advance is going to help retain women in those jobs. I want us to take a page from the healthcare industry and other industries and say, we're going to have 2 or 3 associates assigned to every project so that they can rotate who's on call when. And it's not that everybody has to be on call, 24 hours a day. And so I think if you're actually evidence-based, the changes that firms could make that would really make a huge difference to retaining women actually aren't that expensive. And I think it's just a little bit of laziness, a little bit of lack of creativity, and a lot of the status quo bias where, okay, if it works for men, it must be women that's the problem.
Yeah, and this made me think about some of the research that you've done on what we might think of as persuasion, in the sense of, some of your research with young girls and kind of trying to persuade their parents to stay, like to let them stay in school. I think we could take some of those lessons when it comes to trying to persuade our employers to give us more of what we need in the workplace, or even our partners to give us more of what we need at home. Can you talk a little bit about what you find on that front in terms of like, how do we actually get people on board with what we need, to thrive, whether it's in the workplace or at home?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that study. It's one of my favorite studies that I've ever done, where we taught girls in Zambia to negotiate, and we just went back 10 years later, and we see big impacts from a 2-week negotiation training. Still 10 years later, where we see higher educational attainment, we see later marriage, we see lower rates of HIV. So it was incredibly powerful, and it was specifically designed to empower people who were in a structurally disadvantaged, a structurally disempowered place. Because if we said, like, go be a go-getter and fight for what you want, lean in, right? These girls would have said, like, that's not up to us. Like, we can't do that, right? So we had to teach them how to use relational power and how to carve out what are called win-win solutions, to show their parents that giving something to them didn't mean that it took away something from the parent. It could actually benefit the entire household. And that was what we saw, is that as these girls learned these skills, they started doing things like saying, hey, mom, if I, watch my younger brother today, and that way you can work a little bit longer, can we work together to raise the money for my school fees, right? So they started finding those win-win solutions. And I absolutely think those are tools that we can apply in lots of dimensions, with our kids, with our jobs, because I think sometimes women are afraid to get a good deal for ourselves because we think getting a good deal for ourselves means a bad deal for someone else. It doesn't have to be that way. And so in our, home lives, trying to do everything ourselves is a bad deal. Winning the bread and baking it too, which is the title of one of my papers, is a bad deal. But your spouse doesn't want to be a low-level junior employee at home either. So I think it's time to promote him to co-CEO so you can take real shared ownership of the work that needs to be done. And you let go of some of the mental load, and he's going to be more empowered, and you're going to get to take a nap.
Absolutely. And like to that, on that question, one of the questions that I've had, I think you talk a lot about Eve Rodsky's book, Fair Play. And one of the questions that I have around this, coming out of the research that I've done with couples, is that, so one of the things that she recommends and that you kind of echo in your book is this notion of, once you divide up the tasks, once you decide who's going to handle which pieces of the mental load or the household, that you should just not even know where the broom is, that if you tell him that he's going to handle the cleaning up the kitchen, that you shouldn't even, think about it. And the one piece I worry about on that front is, one thing that I've seen with couples is that the more specialized that they are, the less they talk to each other. The less they have to communicate, and that communication, like that lack of communication that can come with specialization, especially hyper specialization, can undermine, the love that exists in a relationship, and lead to more resentments in the process too. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit about how do we embrace the potential benefits of that kind of like letting go or specialization without losing the communication that's often necessary in the process too.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I want to first, I'll just describe kind of why I think sort of this end-to-end task ownership is important. So, if you are delegating to somebody the task of, make the kids lunch every day, right? Then you're still carrying the mental load of like, are we out of string cheese or not? And did the lunchbox get cleaned out at night, right? And so it feels a lot more frictional than if whoever is making lunch is the person who's responsible for planning the lunch, grocery shopping, packing the lunch, and then cleaning out the lunch boxes, at the end of the day. And then there's learning by doing, where like maybe in the beginning it doesn't work that well, but that person is really able to quickly, become more efficient at that task and learn that like, oh, if you don't take out the old food on Friday, Monday, that's really gross, right? Instead of it being kind of two people are responsible for that. So that's the kind of gains to specialization, is that end-to-end ownership. It lets you see the entire problem and take ownership over it. And it stops women from carrying the mental load for everything, right? And so I do think I say this in the book that like the women I know who are the happiest in their marriage are the women where there is a big area where they are not responsible for it and their husband usually takes complete ownership over it. And an example of that is cooking, is like the women who say like, oh no, he cooks, he grocery shops, I don't even go in the fridge. Like that just takes such a big weight off of women. Now, I don't want that to translate into you're not communicating. My hope is that what this translates into partly is you having time to spend as partners enjoying each other's company rather than, yelling at each other and nitpicking and, fighting because it's like, oh my God, I can't believe you left the strawberries in the lunchbox on Friday, right? So I hope that you're kind of reclaiming some of that quality time, that enjoyment time with one another. But I also think a really important place to communicate is around what success looks like in each of those domains. Because I think where a lot of those frictions come up is that men and women have a very different idea of what success looks like or, what the goal is. So, if it's, okay, the kids have to eat, but one way you get that done is going to McDonald's and another way you get that done is buying fresh produce at the farmer's market and then lovingly preparing it for 2 hours, right? Those are two very different visions of success. And I see something come up that I am going to coin as weaponized indifference. It's the new weaponized incompetence, where the male partner says, well, you're the one who cares what they eat, so you do it. Or you're the one who cares what they wear, so you do it, right? And that's fine if that's, one or two things, right? But if that's everything, that's where I call it weaponized, where it's really just another way of kind of putting women in charge of everything. And so I think having a real conversation around our values around this task, what are we trying to accomplish by doing this? Why are we taking little Johnny to soccer practice? And what are we trying to do when we're packing lunch, for our little bundles of joy? And, how is this serving our shared values as a family, and having a lot of discussion and conversation and alignment there, but maybe not so much around the nitty gritty of then how it gets done, as long as we're aligning on what the objective is and what success looks like.
Yeah, I like that idea of kind of focusing on, shared goals and shared alignment. I think one of the challenges with that piece, I was thinking I did a book event for my colleague, Allison Daminger, with her new book that just came out a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that she talks about is that part of where this difference in, who carries more of the mental load around different areas of family life, often comes from who gets judged more if those things aren't done well. And the way that women are held accountable, the way that men feel judged if their lawn doesn't look nice, like they feel like all the neighbors are looking at them. Women feel judged if their kids' lunchbox is a mess, or if their kids' hair is a mess, or if their kids' clothes are a mess, or if, their house doesn't look neat when someone comes over to, unexpectedly. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts on, how can men and women better communicate, to help each other understand the pressures that they're facing, and not maybe just if they can't come to shared values because they know that they're going to be judged in those different ways potentially.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The society puts more pressure on women, and I also think we put more pressure on ourselves. I think we've internalized messages that say we should be able to do everything in a picture-perfect way, and that's why it was so important for me to start with that time use data that says, like, no, that doesn't add up, because actually being an 80s super corporate career woman and an Instagrammable trad wife are actually two separate full-time jobs that don't fit in one 24-hour day. And the women who are selling you this vision of aesthetic perfection in every domain are lying to you, because that's not their home life. That's their career, right? Producing this content that looks so appealing and looks like something you should be able to do is actually their career. And you bring as much excellence to the table in your career too, but making healthy from scratch dinners with, 6 different colors in each one is not where you've chosen, to have your profession be. So I think it's right that society puts more pressure on women. I think we put more pressure on ourselves, and I think we need to let go of some of that pressure. And I think that's where it's important, when we have that conversation, to surface that, to get to those root causes. When you say, I want this, and that's one of the things I encourage you to do in the book, is when you say, I want this, to say why. What's the actual root of this? You say, like, well, I want our kids to have these beautifully prepared bento boxes. Why? Is it because they're going to feel loved? Is it because it's going to, give them what their friends have, right? Is it because you think that they're more likely to eat healthy food if it looks like that, right? So why is that important to you? And are there other ways to kind of meet those same objectives where you get a higher return on your time? But that's exactly some of those things that, I think that we need to surface. And one of the ways that I recommend couples do it is through generating some internal data within the household. I have the data from the American Time You study, that's the averages, but like every man who has ever seen my data presented was positive it did not apply to him. Which is surprising because they're like, well, not all men. I'm like, yeah, but like the 80th percentile of men and like actually the 95th percentile of men. So, so I think if you track data in your household, you gather some information on how you're spending your time. It cuts through some of the defensiveness because it's not about who's more exhausted and who's like working harder and feels like they're doing more. It's just there's some differences in how we spend our time, and often what I find is that, and if you go to my website, it's CorinneLow.com, I have a tool where you can do this, where you can track your time. What I find is that like men's time at work is work, 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 and women's time at work is work, order groceries on my Zoom meeting, work, respond to a text from the teacher, confirm a doctor's appointment, work, and then, deal with a play date or a pickup snafu, right? And then buy some clothes because I know he's outgrowing his underwear. So
Oh,
yeah, so I think that once you surface that a little bit and people just like didn't even realize, how much inequality there was, that's a conversation starter to try to, because I think it doesn't align usually with men's values. The men who say, when I present my research, like that can't be true of me, it's because they don't want it to be true. They want to do half, they want to do their share. And so we need to kind of make some of that invisible labor visible to actually be able to divide it up.
oh, absolutely, and that tracks perfectly. I talked to one of the women that I interviewed for my book. Kind of high-powered executive, is the primary breadwinner in her household, and she was telling me that she feels like she has two news tickers running in her head at all times. She has the home news ticker and the work news ticker, and where her husband, he just has the work news ticker. That the home one like might pop up when he's at home occasionally, but hers are both going constantly, and she constantly has to be navigating and bouncing back and forth between them. So I think that's a good way to think about these these pressures that we have on women in our modern world. And kind of switching gears a little bit, I want to turn to a question that's, a question that dovetails nicely between one of the questions that was raised by one of the participants for today, that also resonated with some of the topics I was thinking about as I was reading this book and preparing for our conversation today. And Kathy asked, she said, well, what if individualizing and monetizing everything is part of the problem instead of the answer? What about pooling resources? What about taxing the wealthy? And I think, the part of this question that resonated with me as a sociologist has to do with, this kind of optimization. You kind of alluded to this before, kind of the sort of economics model of optimization. And we've kind of talked a little bit about this, that, there's some caveats to where we're optimizing and how we think about, ourselves versus the larger world. But I'm curious about, the equity of this kind of model. Like, on page 128, you say, for example, we're going to take a hard look at the time that you're spending on leisure, home production, and parenting to make sure you're optimizing, and then you emphasize for yourself. And I mean, on the one hand, I get that, men have been able to live like this for generations, been allowed to put themselves first, never think about anybody else. My dad growing up used to say things along the lines of, well, I'm happy. So, I took care of my part. Like, I made myself happy. I did the thing that, like, he had a saying, and I wish I could remember it off the top of my head, but it was sort of this notion of like, well, I took care of myself, so shouldn't that be enough? And so at the same time, and women have never had that permission. But I also worry a little bit about, is that the right model that we should all be striving for? And if you talk in the book about how, the men's way is not necessarily the best way. And that, I think, is, this optimization model is a very gendered model in some ways. So, to give an example, if my happiness depends on having a clean house, but, between my job and my kids, I don't have time to clean it myself to the level that actually makes me happy. And if the only house cleaning service I can afford, employs mostly undocumented immigrant women, who maybe don't have health insurance, maybe make less than $10 an hour, at least by my read, an optimization framework says I should probably just hire that house cleaning service anyway, even if it means that my happiness is bought, essentially through the exploitation of other women who are in more vulnerable positions than I am. And so I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, can we make optimization compatible with equity and justice? And does it have to just be for people that choose that, that value those things? Or are there ways to make an optimization model kind of at its core more fundamentally compatible with a more just world?
Yeah, well, thank you for raising all of those issues. And I think we're very aligned on kind of values here. And I should clarify that when I kind of emphasize optimizing for yourself, what I meant there was for what you actually value, because I think so often we end up taking into account so many of these social pressures and like these models of what we think this is supposed to look like, that we actually don't have a North Star of like, what do we actually value and what am I trying to achieve? And so, that's what I mean by kind of the self and getting to know the self, is like just even getting in touch with what are your values. And, some of those values I think really should be, how your choices affect other people, right? But I also do say in the book, because I think there's a balance, and the balance is just that the thing that drives me crazy is the way that caring for the broader world and the community at large falls entirely on the shoulders of women. And I have seen countless women just driving themselves crazy over the recycling and the composting and the making sure that the used clothes go to the place where they can be used the best, and making sure that we're green and sustainable. And I have literally never seen a man like make himself crazy over all these things. And so I think that that's why there's a balance in saying like, absolutely, we should work, especially when we're in positions of privilege, we should work to solve these structural problems and to make ethical choices ourselves. And I talk a lot about that when it comes to childcare, about the ethics of outsourcing and about, how do you think about this and what choices do you make that kind of make something add up for you as well as adding up for the people that you're employing, if you're privileged enough to be able to do that, right? And by the way, outsourcing, I think, isn't necessarily always inherently unethical, because a lot of times when you're outsourcing something, there's returns to scale that come with the other, entity doing it at scale. But it means maybe you're hiring the more expensive cleaning service that's able to give people health care, right? Rather than absolutely doing it in the cheapest way possible. But I think the balance is that I don't want it to become that it is individual women's responsibility alone to solve these structural problems, rather than, no, if we want there to be less plastic pollution, then we should have regulation and we should have taxes that, charge us the true marginal cost in terms of the cost to society of producing this much plastic, rather than it being upon me to say like, well, now I have to walk a mile to refill my glass bottle with dish soap because I don't want to create that plastic waste. So I absolutely agree, like values wise, we are aligned, and I would never want the message of my book to be that you should care about yourself to the exclusion of caring about the network and the society that we exist within. And I think that changing some of those things requires real collective change, and it's not actually something that you can just do individually.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think your point too, that, we can't just, that we need to change the broader systems, because this is not, men aren't going to, in the incentive structures that we have in place, given our current policies, men aren't going to choose to care more about recycling, aren't going to choose to care more about sustainability, aren't going to choose in many cases to, care more about how well paid, the people who do their outsourced care work are. And so I think you're right that this is a place where systemic solutions, as opposed, and one of the things that frustrates me most about kind of self-help style books is often the notion that women should just, tell men to do more. And often tell men to do more means like tell women to nag more. And that's just, never a sustainable solution, and often puts women at risk too, if they have to be the ones to enforce on men, you should be doing more in those kinds of situations. And so I really appreciated, especially how you turned in the end of the book to those questions of, what can we be doing? What should employers be doing? What can we be doing policy wise? And so I was curious both to hear about, what are some of those solutions that you see as most valuable, and also, what was your choice about where to put those in the book in terms of, whether to weave them through, or most of them show up in the afterword from the book. So I'm curious to hear about that, kind of how you navigated those processes.
Yeah, and I know we're almost out of time, but I will say that the reason I chose to put those in the afterword is because I was writing a book for women. and primarily. And I didn't want women to read the book and say, well, there's all of these systemic problems and I need to wait for these better policies. And so I can't actually improve my own life. I wanted to empower women to read the data, feel seen by it, and then say like, oh, here's the changes that I can make within that highly inequitable framework and that framework that needs a lot of those systemic changes. And so I wanted them in the book because my hope is that there's going to be a chapter of our book, our story as a country where we are going to be able to implement some of those changes. But I didn't want that to get in the way of women being able to feel like the book is actually actionable for me right now. And so, if I could name just one of them, I would say one of the things I'd love to see is I'd love to see subsidies for displaced workers, the same way we subsidize people who are displaced by technological change or trade agreements for women who have gone from economic production in the home for a period of time to wanting to get back in the labor force, often with a lot of human capital. I would love to see government subsidies to, reintegrate those workers.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. My younger sister was a stay-at-home mom for almost 10 years and just went back to teaching full time this year. And, just seeing her, get to that place where she was finally able to be in a position to have, and like many women, it waited until all her kids were in school to be able to get to that point. And so I think that's a great, policy solution in terms of thinking about next steps. So thank you so much for this book. Thank you for this conversation and for engaging on all these topics. I'm super excited to have a chance to chat with you more during after hours too. So yeah, thank you. And thanks to Lonnie for putting this together.
Great conversation, great energy. Boy, I wish I could can it and then duplicate it across all the programming for the rest of the year. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate so much thoughtfulness. Just thank you particularly for preparing so well for the conversation as well. I know Corinne is grateful for really being supported in the event. So thank you. So folks, both of these brilliant people are going to hang out at after hours with us. It's going to go from 8:03 to 8:30. Make a donation. Any dollar amount to FAN meaningful to you is meaningful to us. Make a donation. We'll send you the link to join. Come ask your own questions. It's going to be a blast. So come hang out. I want to offer one question up there if you don't mind, Corinne. So one question that came in, and I think it's maybe, and I see where it's coming in. And hold on, let me just grab it. Sue had asked, can you comment on the issues, particularly that single women face? I know we did spend a fair amount of time looking at women who are partnered, and perhaps even with children, but maybe looking at not just, of course, you can have single parents. There was actually a question about single parents as well, but maybe talk about like, so what's in the book if I'm not yet married? I'm 29 and I'm in my second job, and what's in the book for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I would love to see this book kind of bought for women who are like,
Yes.
graduating college and trying to figure out what to do with their lives, because I think there's a lot of practical advice about choosing a partner. I
Yes.
say that we interview for the wrong position. We interview for the position of boyfriend when we should be interviewing for co-CEO. And so we ask the wrong questions. We ask, what movies do you like? And we don't ask who does your laundry and how much do you like to cook at home and do you know any good recipes, right? So I have that advice about kind of how to think about a partnership and how to, I share my own story of feeling like I just kind of stumbled into a marriage because I had always been so focused on my career. I didn't even think about what I wanted that family and home life to look like. And so, I met somebody that I liked and then I married him, right? But kind of trying to be a little bit more strategic about that and trying to be strategic about your career, trying to think about how is your career going to support you at different stages of your life. And obviously we can't plan the whole thing out from the outset, but how are you making choices that are going to set you up for the most success, are going to give you the most of what economists call option value, where you're able to, respond to the different things that are thrown your way and hopefully get to a point where you're making investments in order to upgrade your time to money machine, right? You're trying to get a better model of that machine where you can put less time in and get more money out. And I think the mistake people sometimes make in their career is they keep investing and investing, but their machine gets worse. They have to keep putting more time into it to get that money out. And so, yeah, that's some of the stuff that's in there. And I really do think that the book speaks to younger women as well.
It's so great. I mean, I know I've told you this already. My galley copy up here is warped on the side because I took it to the beach this summer and I was like, oh my God, I kept telling people, oh my God, this book. It's just, there's so much great stuff that's in there that is just so, the concept of utility, which is kind of counterintuitive. You think, oh, utility, it's about function. It's like, oh no, like joy and contentment and fulfillment. But also the concept of home production, like what does that mean? And it's not, just so everyone's clear, and then I'll be done because we're closing down. is to be clear, Corinne isn't presenting you with here's what your values should be. I mean, I think a good piece about what you're talking about is you're encouraging people to spend a lot of time with values clarification and values identification. And these are very individualistic pursuits in terms of what is actually important to me, and maybe, with the help of a good therapist, and why is that important to you? Like taking a quick look at that. But anyway, we are done. We're at 8 o'clock. Thank you, ladies. We'll see you at 8:03 in the after hours rooms. Folks, come hang out with us. This has only gotten started, and we're only going to have 27 minutes with these two lovely ladies. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you soon. Thank you, thank you, thank you.